Good mid-morning to everyone. I'm Eileen Parks. I'm a Brattleboro Literary Festival committee member, and I'd like to welcome you here to our event. And I'm filling in for Stephanie, who made these beautiful intros, so I cannot take credit for them. She is ill and can't make it. So this year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our festival sponsors, Brattleboro Community Television, Jenny Altschuler and Barry Green, Elizabeth Catlin, the Stepansky Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and Poets and Writers. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and we encourage you to support them. The festival is run entirely by volunteers, but has very real expenses. So we encourage you to make a donation at one of the donation boxes sometime this weekend, or you can use the QR code to donate online through our website. Please take a moment now to turn off the ringer on your cell phone. I personally always just go into airplane mode because then you're saving battery anyway. Okay, but feel free to use it to take photos and share them on social media. Our first author is Amitava Kumar. Kumar was born in the city of Ara in the Indian state of Bihar on 17th of March. Kumar holds numerous degrees in political science from Hindu College, Delhi University, 2 master's degrees in linguistics and literature from Delhi University and Syracuse University, respectively. In 1993, he received his doctoral degree from the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. Kumar lives with his family in Poughkeepsie, New York. He's also a professor of English holding the Helen D. Lockwood Chair at Vassar College. Kumar is the author of Husband of a Fanatic, Bombay, London, New York, Passport Photos, the book of poems No Tears for the NRI, and As Nobody Does the Right Thing in 2009. His book, A Foreigner Carrying in the Crook of His Arm a Tiny Bomb, a writer's report on the global war on terror, was awarded the best nonfiction book of the year in the Asian American Literary Awards. Husband of a Fanatic was an editor's choice book at the New York Times, Bombay, Bombay, London, New York was on the list of books of the year in New Statesman in the UK, and Passport Photos won an Outstanding Book of the Year award from the Myers Program for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights in North America. His novel, Home Products, was shortlisted for India's premier literary prize, the Vodafone Crossword Book Award. We are in touch with a great, astonishing mystery when we put honest words down on paper to register a life and to offer witness. Everything else is ordinary, Kumar writes. Salman Rushdie writes of Beloved Life, this profound book is full of lives whose beauty lives in the wholeness of their telling. A father, a daughter, a crime, a country being born, a migration, another country, a plague. His novel offers magnificent witness and is not ordinary, but extraordinary. Please welcome Amitava Kumar.
Okay. I was told that we should talk a little bit about the process of writing the book and then maybe do a little reading. So, everyone cool with that? You know, some years ago I read in a review by John Updike that novels at a particular point of time were how readers would read and learn about how to shave, or if you have read Jane Austen's novels, how to behave at a dance. You understand that? Novels as a way of bringing news also, and to know how to conduct oneself in society, stuff like that. Well, I don't think literature serves that function anymore. You maybe watch a TV serial and you learn how to walk on the street or how to dress. But I think, in some ways, if what we read allows us to imagine, I think there's a line in Sigrid Nunez's novel, yeah, but I'm thinking there's a line that goes something like, isn't it something about literature? That was funny. Literature, here I am trying to recover, against the decline in all your faculties, including memory, trying to recover. One wonderful line. Auntie, there's a line that goes something like, isn't literature supposed to teach you what it means to be alive now, or something like that, in The Friend. And I think that sense of what, on a day-to-day basis, does it mean to be alive, to be receiving the news. I love the moment in a novel I was reading during the Trump era. I mean, is the Trump era over? I don't know. Yes, I know. By a British writer, Olivia Lang, and they're at a wedding, and a character says, "Oh, Steve Bannon has resigned." You know what I'm saying? You're eating wedding cake, but that moment is somehow someone looks at the phone and says, "Oh, Steve Bannon has resigned." I thought there was something happening there, and then if the story can reveal to you a little bit of the dilemmas of, are we doing enough? Or what are we threatened by? What will the next moment bring? Any of these things, I think, is where I think novels can still do that work. Returning to shaving, my children are here. Ra, can you stand up? Stand up. Yeah. Yesterday, 2 days ago, he said, okay, yeah, there he is. He said, "Dad, can you shave me?" And I said, "Sure." Feeling altruistic. And then when I began to shave him, a thought struck me, and I said to him, "Okay, listen, when I'm old," I'm already old, but what I was saying was, I said to him, when I'm unable to shave, you better perform this task, all right? And he said, "Yeah, all right, Dad, I'll do it with great care," etc., which is great. But I think when our parents begin to age, that's our first intimation, or at least it was for me, of mortality. You think about death, and you think about, how do I memorialize this, or how do I give this life a certain dignity, a certain telling, give it shape a narrative around this parent's life. You know what I'm saying? And then, both my kids are here, I just don't want them to feel very guilty about this, but seeing them grow up is this second profound sense of mortality. It's like, damn, shouldn't I prepare the will? Still. Are they going to put me in an old people's home? Or are they going to take care of me, etc.? You know what I'm saying? I'm sharing all this because my father died last year, and even sitting in the ICU, I was thinking, oh, I have already written this novel. The novel had just been submitted. In fact, when I was there in the ICU, I checked my phone, and the editor sent this cover. She said, "I know this is a difficult time, but maybe this will be a welcome distraction," or something like that. It wasn't, but you know what I'm saying? I was like, okay. So what I'm saying is, you're sitting in the ICU, your father is about to die. Literature can give you, or at least it gave me, words to already in some ways prepare myself, almost to preempt the happening, and then to recognize in everything that followed that the books did carry an impress of all that was happening, a sense of the suffering, a sense of the loss, and then later again to think more about it. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was that, the title, My Beloved Life, comes from 2 lines of Louise Glick, our Nobel laureate. And the lines are, "Death cannot harm me more than you have harmed me, my beloved life." And I thought that irony was nice and suitable. I thought I'll steal that the moment I read it. I thought I was on a Metro North. How many of you have been on Metro North trains? Some of you, yes. Because, I teach at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, and any trip to the city means you have to go on Metro North. I was on Metro North, and I was reading a novella really, by Dennis Johnson, called Train Dreams. And it is about a lumberjack, a woodworker in Idaho, And we start in the early part of his life, and then we come to the end. It's a very slim novel. And despite its slimness, when you finish with it, you feel you have been delivered an epic. Maybe because it covers the arc of a life, and it is studied with extraordinary details. I felt, maybe because 5 letters, Idaho, is just like 5 letters, India. I thought, what if I changed Idaho to India? How would things be different? I thought of a story that I was always told as a boy, that in my village, my grandmother had reached for a twig in a crack in the wall. She would always keep a neem, I don't know what the Latin name is. Neem is a particular kind of tree, antibacterial properties. Capitalists have made soap out of it, but in the village, they use the twigs to use it as a brush. When she reached for a twig one morning, a cobra bit her. That story was a part of the origin story almost of my father's birth, because my grandmother was pregnant with my father. And the other story I'd always heard about, that my father's elder sister, as a baby, was licked by a fox. This is the detail. Was licked by a fox and she died. And I thought I'll put that in, just as a starting story. And in an essay about my mother's death many years earlier, I've spoken about how, in Hindu families, before the cremation, your head is shaved. And I went with my father to get our heads shaved. And I was full of grief, and I was silent, sullen almost. Sullen also because my father began to ask the barber who was shaving his head which year he was born and where he was born. And when the barber began to give him details, my father began to tell him what was the price of chicken in that year he was born, and now what the price was and how the price of fuel had changed. And I began to get irritated and angry. My father had an incredible memory. He would not have faltered over remembering the line from Sigrid's novel. I was driving across a bridge once, and my father was dozing at the back. This was during a recent visit a few years ago, and the driver said to me when the car bounced a bit, he said, "This bridge is a very old bridge. It was, I think, from the British time." And my father from the back said, "It was inaugurated on 15th May in 1945 by Major blah, blah, blah Williamson." So it was that kind of a guy. In any case, what was I saying? I just wanted to put in these details that I had heard, but there were other details that I would like to ask him, and he was a historian. He wanted to do an accounting almost, because he remembered what prices were. That was his way of dealing with my mother's death at that moment. He wanted to present history and the way time had passed, the time that he had been married, by remembering how prices of chicken and eggs had changed. You know what I'm saying? Which was a later, more generous interpretation I gave to the events of that morning. When I started thinking about this book, after reading the Johnson book, I would ask him, putting him in the place, in the sort of a field he was most comfortable in, I would say to him, "How much did you earn at that time?" Or, "What was the price of postal letters, stamps? What happened when that war was fought?" And he would give me crisp little details, which I would note down, and then I later turned it into a book. One final detail I want to mention to you is that when I started publishing books, my father, who had been a bureaucrat, decided that he should publish books too. Great. I shouldn't laugh. This is a free country. Everyone has a right to write books. But I resented a little bit that at the book launch, Lawrence Wright, I don't know whether you guys read him, he's a wonderful nonfiction writer. He wrote The Looming Towers, which won major awards about the attacks on 9/11. He was in India for a literary festival. I was there, and my book was being released, a foreigner carrying in the crook of his arm a tiny bomb. And my father self-published his first book that day and asked his publicist and the publisher to come to that event And so there is my book, but he has his collection of books there. And he insisted on my being introduced to the publisher and the publicist. And the publicist said, I hope you'll publish with us also one day. I said, okay. So at the heart of this book is a father's account of that life, told in third person. But there's also a sense that I borrowed from people like Hanif Qureshi and V.S. Naipaul, who had fathers who had failed as writers. Cool? So I've got that sense, because in each of the books I have written, there's always a sense of, or an account of, a striving to write, and how the achievement of the written word is in some ways the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, or because I think I have never overgrown or outgrown that impulse to be a writer, and I always want to present that sense. And the sense of the failure too is there at the book. The other thing is that after the book was written, or that part was written, I recalled that wonderful line of John Burgess, which has been used as an epigraph by at least two writers, Arundhati Roy and Michael Ondaatje. And the epigraph goes something like, never again will a story be told as though it were the only one. Sigrid, I recall that line rather fluently. Just because I enjoyed that, let me repeat it. Never again will a story be told as though it were the only one. And so the second part, after completing that story about the father, I began thinking, what would his daughter's story be? Because I was thinking also how my father was a little bit clueless about my sister's lives. In fact, to end my long anecdotes, when my father died, I found the letters I had sent him all stowed in a polythene bag. Those are the time before email and WhatsApp, when you sent letters. One of the letters was a typed letter I had sent, perhaps in an effort to be more formal, in which I had described a guy that he had asked me to visit because he wanted my sister, my younger sister, to marry this person. My sister married him. She had not met him till the day they got married. He was a software engineer from our caste. Things that are very common in India. But I had been asked to go and visit him. I found him extraordinarily dull. His fridge was bare. His bed was dirty. The whole apartment was filthy. And I thought my sister would have to come and clean this up. You know what I'm saying? So the letter had been remarkably preserved, but it had also been entirely ignored. My sister married that fellow. I don't like him much, but let me not go on. My children are here, so I should not. We might see them at Thanksgiving. So the second part is the daughter's account. The daughter becomes a journalist. She comes to America. She travels the world, and she says some things. I'll just read a couple paragraphs. My father was born in a town in India, which was the same town where George Orwell was born. When I always thought my father, in his desire to write, wanted to be a little bit like Orwell. Whether my father wanted to be like that or not, I certainly did. So in these two paragraphs, you'll get a sense of that. I was a child when I first heard the name George Orwell. I was aware that when we were in the company of educated people in Patna, my father would tell them that he was born in the same hospital as Orwell in Motihari. I later found out that Orwell was indeed born in the same sleepy town as my father, close to our ancestral village, Khewali. But it is quite likely that Orwell's mother had given birth in the small bungalow that served as the Orwell residence. Richard Blair, Orwell's father, was a sub-deputy opium agent for the British. The bungalow in which they had lived in Motihari, now a dilapidated cowshed overrun by pigs and stray dogs, was described recently in one Patna newspaper as an animal farm. My father taught history in Patna. He believed in the past, and it would be only a slight exaggeration to say that he was suspicious of anything new. Unlike Orwell, my father was lucky to have lived to an old age. In his last days, he was attended only by the teenager who had been his help for 4 years. I have been away, living and working for nearly 20 years in Atlanta. One morning during the pandemic, I was woken up by my phone ringing. I wondered whether it was my father, and this will be the greatest regret of my life. I let him go to voicemail. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next author, Tyriek Rashawn White, is a writer, musician, and educator from Brooklyn, New York. His novel, We Are a Haunting, won the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and was also a finalist for the Gotham Book Prize and the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Fiction. In 2024, he was named a National Book Foundation 535 honoree. He has received fellowships from Callaloo, New York State Writers Institute and Key West Literary Seminar, among other honors. He is currently the media director of Lampblack Literary Foundation, which seeks to provide mutual aid and resources to Black writers across the diaspora. He holds a degree in creative writing and Africana studies from Pitzer College and has earned an MFA from the University of Mississippi. We Are a Haunting is a work of deep lyricism and power that addresses the fallout from deracination and enslavement. Ghosts mingle with the living, who are sensitive and strong enough to hear them. It is a beautiful book, both about New York and about reclamation. Please welcome Tyriek White.
It's a hard act to follow. Thank you all for coming. I feel so privileged to be able to come speak, talk about this little thing that I wrote that came out about a year ago. And I like to think about it, first novel for sure, but I'm a hip hop head, so like this is like, this is like Reasonable Doubt for me. This is like Illmatic for me. This is, De La's first album, 3 Feet Rising. You know what I mean? So, and they say your first album is, your whole life. So while it only took me 2 years to write this, I feel like I've been writing it my whole life. A lot of it is full of kind of the stories that I grew up listening to from, I used a lot of, what I call living archives to kind of write this book. Because a lot of it is an experience I know well, a young kid growing up in the city in sort of the early 2000s. The art, the music, the textures, like that I can tell you very deeply. But a lot of this book also takes place in the 1980s, 1990s, and even further back. So in order to kind of tap into sort of the details of that time period, like I used a lot of the living archives, the embodied archives that I had available to me. My cousins, my brothers, my grandmother, my parents, and soaking up, for a lifetime, I guess, these stories, these folklores, these myths of, this little 4-block radius that we grew up in. And for me, I set out with the goal to kind of write this coming-of-age story, about a young kid. But in writing it and being in Mississippi, it grew. It grew into something that, I couldn't really control or put a word to. At first, it was about this young kid, but then it became this conversation. I wanted to, it was focusing on Kali, who is the main character, and he loses his mom, and how he sort of deals with the grief, the fallout of that. But I suddenly, the mother's voice came to me, and I was compelled to kind of write this scene, sort of entrenched in, in Morrison's Song of Solomon. There's the myth of the flying Africans who, during the voyage or the kidnapping over the Atlantic, they rebelled against their, the captain and the ship crew, threw them overboard. And it was this reference to them walking back to Africa, right? Through the Atlantic, this very beautiful spiritual scene, this idea of kind of like collective suicide, right? That for us in Western kind of culture, is suicide's a no-no. But this kind of collective radical sort of movement kind of colors a lot of Morrison's work, also colors a lot of kind of, the work of all of us who are kind of like building this myth, building this folklore of sort of African Americans in America. So with this voice, I was kind of, compelled, or I had to write from the perspective of Kali's mom. And so a lot of it was me, writing from the perspective of, what I think my grandmother was thinking, what I think my mom was thinking, and what they went through in those time periods. And, it was tough, especially as, someone who self-identifies as a heterosexual dude. It was like very difficult to kind of write from the perspective of a black woman raising a son. But I think it kind of allowed me and my own kind of mother to have a different relationship, right? Because it put me in a different place in sort of thinking about how we related and how families relate sort of when we lose someone. This book kind of, there's a part where Kali reflects on, he's constantly reflecting on this loss, but there's this moment where he sort of pulls out this obituary from his mother's funeral, and he's kind of going through it and like blacking out certain lines and creating this blackout poem. And this was sort of my own process. This was the obituary I wrote for my grandmother, and I did the same thing. I turned it into art. I turned it into poetry, and I was able to put it in the book in this way to sort of develop this character and examine his loss. So it's a very personal book, but it's also one that I think shows a New York we don't really read about, shows communities of people who make New York go that we typically don't hear about. And I got to kind of write about ghosts, which was pretty cool. So I'll read a bit from Kali's section. Miss Betty lived on the same floor as me, and may or may not have been the meanest woman in the neighborhood. She was missing a few teeth from all the rock she did. She purportedly stopped some years back, and her skin was like coffee, her eyes, nails, and teeth stained. She lolled around the sprawling lawn, the grass thinned by countless touch football games played across it, down the path to the courtyard where Zaire and I sat. A year had passed since he helped me get suspended, but I didn't blame him. Like the one before it, summer dragged on in the worst way, the crescendo where we almost begged for September to roll around and school to start, if only to fill the hours. I remember when you was this tall, Miss Betty said to me. Her hand came up to her stomach. You have $1, Papa? I don't have a thing, Miss Betty. I'm sorry. I lied. She scowled at us, buzzed into the building, and shuffled inside. I usually saw her by the laundromat, limping past the faded shop windows. In the middle of the day, a dust head might come to the bodega window, the price of a sandwich and soda and coins inside a paper cup. They patrolled Linden Boulevard between Hendricks and Van Sicklen, stood by the storefronts during the day, asking passerbys for change, anything at all. There were a couple shelters in the neighborhood, one that had closed down months ago and sent dozens away to different corners and bus stops and stairwells. The ones who got high marched through the hood all day, putting pieces together, running errands for businesses or sweeping the fronts of shops. Miss Betty was the oldest of them all. Lou, Zaire's older brother, showed us his tray bags once, jagged stones that looked like yellow teeth in the palm of his hand. He spoke at us with conviction, with the conviction of those conspiracy theorists on the subway, so we tended to get swept along anyway. Someone would appear at his side, as sudden as a sparrow might spring from its perch, asking for two with their head down, and Lou would vanish with them around a corner. Today, the sun got all over everything, over the boys and girls by the community center, a hot day that brought the bees out. And I could hardly remember a time before this. The light stung my eyes, made my shoulders feel as if the skin would break open. August couldn't end sooner. I had to put my hand up to see what Zaire said. They threw quarters at her the other day. Who? I asked. Some older kids, he told me. We sat outside my building watching folk, women with strollers or housing workers on their perpetual breaks. The blocks had to be a third of a mile long each, from Skank to Ashford, Stanley Avenue cutting through them like a gray blister. Tenements like towering space stations wrecked on some forgotten planet, old relics that housed colonies of the disillusioned. I liked to look up at my window, almost expecting to see you, Ma, leaning against the bars with a Newport. You'd lay a towel out, a pink or a baby blue, and rest your elbows along the windowsill. The girls from the community center passed and waved, and Mr. Frank pushed toward us with a cart full of laundry. The back right wheel was stuck and dragging along the sidewalk as he pushed it. He argued something with Miss Morales and sat on the bench across from us in front of the building with the scene foam awning with the ladies from the Tenant Association. They talked in circles, shook boxes of cigarettes like a ritual. After a while, Mr. Frank called Zaire over to send him to the store. I'm not going, I said, looking up at him. Fine, I'll be back. He shoved his hands in his pocket and headed toward Stanley's side, toward the bodega on the corner. Not like the boy need exercise, said Mr. Frank. Y'all so skinny nowadays, Miss Moore chimed in, looking at me. That's 'cause the women don't cook, the old man grunted. Or maybe you ate it all, your big ass, Miss Morales said, and they all busted up. Mr. Frank's laugh was like sugarcane. Miss Morales and Miss Moore's like ginger. They carried their home countries in the shapes of the words in their mouths and the way their backs straightened. Miss Morales was from Puerto Rico, said she came as a girl when nothing but Polish couples and mothers whose husbands died in the war lived in these buildings. Said she had a school teacher with the thickest accent who looked like Myrna Loy and always brought in homemade donuts. She didn't want to stay after the war until her husband had returned missing a hand and couldn't work. She taught here to this day, aged and less inclined to bring in anything homemade. I don't remember anything from when I had her in third grade other than supermarket pound cake. Over the years, those early migrants moved down flatlands and farther into Brooklyn, the Italians to Bay Ridge, the Polish closer to Manhattan Beach and Coney Island, and into the rest of Long Island, buying up property in Howard Beach along the Shellbank Basin. Now, as an old woman with bright red hair and glasses she wore to read coupon books, Miss Morales would watch from the third-story window or from the lobby where the Tenant Association became a watch group, sitting around a fold-out table playing 21. To us, she represented parental authority, often knew what our mothers would say before we did, knew us as the faces of our parents. I was Key's boy. Miss Moore leaned across the bench, her hospital cane like a staff in her hand, crossed in a regal way, one atop another. How's your dad holding up? He's doing what he can, I said. You all must be a wreck over there. We're doing okay, Miss Moore. I lost my mother too. It felt like my whole world was coming apart. You have to pray, son. Do you pray? Can't you see the boy don't want to talk about it, Dad? Miss Morales exclaimed. We're having a moment here, okay? Could you quiet your old self? I'm old. Sophia from Golden Girls here says, I'm old. Look, both of y'all old as shit, all right? Mr. Frank said, exacting his revenge. Zaire came back with a couple of Lucy's and a lottery ticket for Mr. Frank. He turned to me. Want to come to mine for dinner? Sure, I said. I knew he felt bad for me. Pop was hardly there, and Toya spent nights at Nana's. When she was there, she was painting her toes, covered in the blue light of her flip phone, her boyfriend on the other end. The two hardly spoke to each other, more to the people around them, as if letting the other hear the world as they went through it. I missed sneaking out after the heat put everyone to sleep, and Toya, who always threatened to tell, would never say anything to you or Pop. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
To the both of you, that was terrific. So we're the second half is they're going to have a little conversation. Stephanie had a starter question. After I say what it is, I'm going to pass the mic to you. And Tobin noticed a little bit of feedback when you were this close, so we'll do that. Okay, so here it is. Here's the starter question. And I think what it will do, we'll start a conversation between them, and it might elicit a question and from someone in the audience too. So after they talk back and forth for a little bit, we'll offer you a chance to ask a few. All right, so here it is. You both tell gargantuan stories through the mingled lives of people who would not be considered important or famous, but the reach of their understanding is vast. Can you talk about that process, its challenges, surprises, and rewards?
Sure thing. Tyriek, first group.
Oh, man. So for me, you know, I always sort of set out to write this kind of tale about these working class people, mainly because I grew up working class, and also growing up kind of working class in New York City is sort of this weird experience because you're sort of constantly funneling into the city. You're sort of making the gears of empire work. And you're toiling away, and you're under this sort of constant threat of displacement, of losing your job, of the train messing up, so you get to work late and you get docked or you get, you know, reprimanded. So many millions of people who live in cities similar to New York, all over the globe, are kind of pushed, are kind of pushed out. You know, I went to France 2 weeks ago, and it was sort of a similar layout. You know, like you get to the airport, and you know the drive to France to Paris is, you know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever. But in between there's, you know, all these factories, all these warehouses, all these apartment blocks, these public housing complexes. So you see it everywhere, mostly people of color, but you see it everywhere. Cities that push out working people who make, again, empire go. So I was very, you know, I've always been interested in kind of the intimate lives of unimportant people. Of people who kind of make this country go. And for me, it was about not, you know, uplifting these characters to the level of, you know, literature with the capital L, or, you know, proving these people's humanity or anything like that, because that's depraved. But more so, fashioning these complex and layered inner lives, you know, because we're told this myth that, you know, people don't have time to think, people don't have time to read. Working people, you know, like being raised by like someone with 2 jobs or someone with, a job off the books, and they tell you you have to work twice as hard. You have to, I don't have time to be in my feelings and reflect and think about the existential nature of my life in this country. But in fact, we all do, plenty of working people do. So it was very important to me to sort of craft this interior life for people who work every day, or people who do manual labor, or people who, are sort of on the outskirts of society. Yeah.
Sure. The question that is asked about an ordinary life struck me as evocative, because there is a book called An Ordinary Life that came out in India, where I'm from. And it is a book by the person who headed the election commission there. But what is remarkable is that there's no single important, quote-unquote, meeting that it is described, no important personage who is described in the book. Instead, it is about an account of his father, who, when this man who achieved this high station in life, when he was 9 years old, he's taken to a railway station because he's going to boarding school. But the father is in a divided state of mind because his daughter is in the hospital with a terrible attack of pneumonia. And so what the father does to this boy is, he says to another passenger, as total stranger, will you please, if you're going to that town, when you arrive in that town, will you take my son to the school? And the passenger says yes. Cool? And this detail is, for this person who headed the election commission, an important part about what an ordinary life was. Not simply the idea, somehow, in some ways, trusting, first, being unmanned, if that's the word one wants, by the situation where you don't have the resources. Second, believing enough in humanity to give your child over to a stranger to take to the place. And all of this working all right. This is how ordinary people dealt in life. That was an important lesson for me. And I thought I needed to capture a little bit of that sense. Most people, before the telecom revolution that introduced cell phones and cheap flip phones, even in the third world, most people in the world had not used a telephone. Forget about owning a telephone. All my life, till I became 20, 21, 22, I was very aware when you had to call someone from another home because a call had come, et cetera, et cetera. So this sense of, I don't want to call it deprivation, but everything that is taken for granted, not being a part of the apparatus of everyday living for people, and then being able to also access other emotions or other support or the sense of a community or being in a society, all of that for me marks the ordinary life. I think it is childish to want to read novels, or to certainly write novels, which are all about triumphs. Your superhero goes out into the world, changes her clothing, and is able to conquer evil. I think you should get rid of that by the time you're 7 years of age or something. And certainly by the time you have stopped dressing up for Halloween. I think this Halloween, all of us should dress as the ordinary person and try to find greater meaning in it. Yeah. Let's entertain questions from the crowd. Unless you have some pressing need to say something to each other.
Not at all.
Yeah. Please.
So this is...
Let me introduce Roxana Robinson to Tyriek. As your elder, let me introduce you, the wonderful writer, Roxana Robinson.
Also your elder. So this is really for both of you. First, for Amitava, I'm interested in your conversations with your father. Could you talk about language? What was your first language? Were you and your brother speaking in English? Okay, so talk about the transition from whatever your first language was. And Tyriek, your spoken language that you're using in your book is different from the spoken language that you're using with us. The written language, I mean, written and spoken are different. So do you want to talk about, both of you just talk about the language that you use and the language that you write with, because it's an interesting.
Sure. Approaching that question of language, let me also say there is a language that fiction, relying on intimacy and secrecy, tells you about. I'm taking it in a slightly metaphorical level first, and then I'll come to the literal one. I asked my mother, before I interviewed my father, when my mother was still alive, I said to her, "You did not meet my father till the night you married him. What was the first night about?" I could not look at her while I was talking because we have never had these conversations. In the stupor of the afternoon heat in India, I was just lying on the bed and she was sitting next to me. And I had a book on my chest which I was reading. And the next day I was leaving India. I had gone for a short break. My mother said something like, "I did not know him." She was a graduate. She was a literary person actually, but she had been taken to the village and the home did not have a toilet yet. She spoke about that, how she had to go out, etc. But the next day when I was on the plane, when I opened my book to read, there was a letter in it. It was not a letter she had written to me. It was a letter that my father had written to her a few weeks after their marriage. And they were distant at that time. They were in two different towns. And that language was so vivid and physical. I stopped reading after maybe 2 paragraphs. What I want to say is that I had not accessed with my parents an intimate language, ever. And in some ways, literature allows you to approach that. So that's the first point. Now, the less metaphorical answer is, we speak a dialect, not so much in written form at all. And my father, over and over during my childhood, would say every time when New Year's Eve arrived, he would say, "From tomorrow we will start speaking only in Hindi, not the dialect anymore," because it is a sign of being rustic. I'm from India's poor estate, and our language in some ways therefore is derided as the language that is of the rustic. And he would say, "Okay, everyone," the equivalent of a quarter. He would say, "You have to pay a quarter if you use any word from our language. You have to speak Hindi now." It never worked. And whenever I would speak, even on the phone, we always spoke on the dialect. And a very quick third point I want to say is, I've already spoken twice today about this meeting that happens on the first night of the marriage, etc., etc. The other thing happens is, when the bride leaves the home of her parent, a small adult is supposed to accompany her. It's, in my community, this idea of protection, whatever. I was often chosen for all my cousin sisters because I was the only guy who spoke English. So because I had gone to a missionary school, Irish fathers from the Society of Jesus, Jesuits, teaching us. So I was a kind of a little English-speaking mascot who was sent because I would be accompanied there. When I arrived at the new house, the groom's house, people would ask me things like, "Can you tell us, how will you speak in English this line?" And they would say in Hindi what the translation would be, "Before I arrived at the railway station, the train had already left the platform," or something like that. And then people, after I had recited a line, people would clap. So language exists in a hierarchy of power. And intimacy sometimes breaches these walls and takes you back to where you belong or where you had wanted to be and makes you alert to different places. Your turn.
Kind of speaking to that hierarchy, sort of a power that's embedded in language. There's this educator who came up with this kind of opposition to code switching, right? He called it code meshing as opposed to code switching. Because when you switch, you're kind of privileging certain languages in different spaces, right? So, if you're in school or you're in a corporate environment, you privilege this space by bringing into it, I guess the Queen's English or this kind of, I guess the way that I kind of have to talk to you right now, right? With a sense of professionalism, that I know what I'm talking about, that I'm not just like using slang and colloquialisms, even though, that wouldn't take away from anything I have to say or anything that I've written. So for me, I kind of thought of this book as the ultimate kind of code mesh, right? So it's definitely written in the lineage of kind of, Baldwin and Morrison, the kind of, or Henry James, this kind of dense, descriptive, poetic kind of voice. But, the characters speak and they relate to each other in sort of more intimate ways. But for me, it was again, meshing these things. Like, I'm a student of Baldwin, of Morrison, of June Jordan. But also, I come from this place that I love and respect and revere, and which I carry with me in the way that I write, the rhythm of it, the bounce of it, the musicality of it, So even the book itself is bringing kind of, Foucault and Saidiya Hartman and Chaucer, and putting it sort of in conversation with, Gloria Naylor or, Jay-Z or like Biggie Smalls or the movie Coolie High, bringing kind of the art, the media, the things that, the archive that I grew up in, that I like and enjoy and has crafted me, but also this kind of language. The first New York book I read, well, vaguely, that I remember kind of being immersed in was Another Country by Baldwin, which is kind of this sweeping, right, examination of not just the city and multiple cities, but, the people in the city, the relationships, the dynamics. So for me, it was just, how do I have this vessel and kind of bring all the things that make me, in a sense? How can I bring those things together in a kind of cohesive, maybe not so cohesive, definitely not linear kind of work? And, hopefully that kind of happened and that answers your question.
And this is for you, because I read your book about years ago when it first came out, and I remember just being blown away how young you were and how wise. And so you talk about all these influences on your work. How do you have that be part of you, but yet get out of the way so that you can create your own work? And how did you have any kind of voice in you saying, I can't really do this? Or was the story so compelling that you just overruled those voices?
Several voices. It's like a choir. Don't do this. You can't do this. No, but I think it was, amazing question.
Just repeat the question, Tyriek. I think I heard someone say.
Is there...
What were the influences, and did Tyriek have voices in his head saying, you cannot?
How did you get out of the way of all that history that you've taken in,
right,
and let your own story be told?
Right.
And did you have, because it is so different, did you have, talk about anything negative? It's so confident.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of...
Thank you. Yeah, so getting out of the way of kind of the influences, the history, the art, all of the things that influenced me. And I think art is really sort of all about that too, just getting out of the way sometimes, right? And I think, like I said, this was a coming of age sort of story about this young boy, but it became this intergenerational story because I was listening to one of the voices, the voices of his mother and his grandmother. So I was able to kind of let them lead me in a sense. And I think that's how I kind of, it's easy to kind of get sucked into, I'm writing a story about public housing in New York. I think there's ways to really get bogged down and flattened and kind of, you've read that before. So I think sort of disrupting two things. I think disrupting genre, so looking to Isabel Allende or like Juan Rulfo or 100 Years of Solitude. Yeah, right. And sort of this the magical realism of Latin America and how these deeply personal stories overlaid with these social political kind of movements, right? But the magic the genre the magical realism of it kind of is sometimes the only way to kind of express the idiosyncrasies of like just living in America or living in any part of the world. So I think it was disrupting genre, but also I was in Mississippi when I wrote this book. So a lot of the language or the way that I described New York is very entrenched in kind of the natural world or the southern kind of landscape, like my community it's all the way east Brooklyn, right? Like right by the border of Queens before you get to JFK. And it's on this estuary, once you get past like the warehouses and all these brick buildings, you get to the bay and it opens up into the Atlantic Ocean. So there were all these opportunities to kind of describe the city in this kind of foreign or different language that I wasn't used to. So I think genre and also language kind of helped me, take a step back.
This is for Tyriek. When you were going back to those ghosts, like your grandmother, for instance, you had said that your relationship with your mother kind of improved as you tried to write in her voice. I'm wondering if you did any kind of research or like, how did the times affect how you translated that voice? Did you do research, historical research for your grandma, and like, how did you get at those voices through actual facts of what was going on at that time?
Yeah. It's a good question. I did a lot of research. I did a lot of, not only just situating the world and the historical context of kind of each character, but also, listening to. So I have an obsession with like late '80s, early '90s movies. So like Juice, like Paid in Full, New Jack City. Like it's a very particular genre. And just like early '90s hip hop. Like I'm, and that's because I had an older brother who was like 10 years older than me. So like when I was 7, he's 17, bumping the most murderous music you've heard. So I think I had all of these kind of inclinations, but I did sort of do the research and like asking my mom about my grandmother and like their lineage. There's a family tree in here that is like an actual kind of family tree that I parsed from my aunt as she gave this lovely speech at a family reunion. And I was like, oh, it's great. Like it's kind of the whole thing. And sort of, again, approaching, say my aunties or my mom in this way, not in this kind of interview, like I'm gonna interview you, but, in this very subtle kind of reconnaissance, right? but also, again, these embodied archives and treating it like that. You know, what were you wearing back in the day? How were y'all, you know, what were you listening to? What were you into? So sort of all the colors and sounds and textures, I kind of had to get secondhand, but I think, again, treating, you know, people as, again, a wealth of like this grand kind of archival project, right? This human life being this grand archival project of inclinations and idiosyncrasies and all the things that you like and have accumulated. Kind of being open to that and approaching and asking someone questions with that in mind, if that makes sense. Yeah, of course.
If there's no other questions, I think that we'd like to have time for the authors to be able to sign books if you'd like to get one. So they're at the back table. So I just want to thank you both so much.
Thank you.